I'm a big fan of horror movies and always have been. I grew up in the 1980s, when horror movies were a lot better and more hardcore than they are nowadays, at least to me. I'm not saying you don't get an occasional good one nowadays, but they're not really anywhere near as fun as they used to be. There was a lot more gore and killing and not as much CGI, just a lot of old school horror and practical effects. A lot of those movies were really gritty as well, not the PG-13 sort of horror you see nowadays. On the weekends, I would normally rent out several movies. Many of them at the time were direct-to-video releases, and I'd have a weekend night marathon to myself. Anyone who grew up on horror and video stores in the 80s has to have fond memories of seeing boxes for movies. You know, Sleepaway Camp, Evil Dead 2, Return to Horror High. Well, I grabbed up mine and hunkered down in my basement bedroom to watch the movies. My family wasn't really into these sorts of films like I was. It didn't really matter to me though. I was fine to watch all this stuff completely on my own. When I was about 16 years old, I rented out another batch of movies to watch. I even remember exactly which ones. Texas Chainsaw Massacre, which surprisingly somehow I'd never seen up to that point. The Hills Have Eyes, and some cheap indie film called Dead Time Stories. None of them seemed tremendously scary to me, I guess, but that wasn't really the point of all this. I had a pretty wild imagination, and I like to force myself to get scared pretty easily. By the time I'd finished watching, it was already well past 2 a.m. I hadn't had anything to eat in a while, so I went up into the main house and made myself something to snack on. I was actually upstairs for about 40 minutes. We weren't allowed to eat in our bedrooms. I had been okay walking around the house upstairs for the most part, but when I went back down to the basement to go to bed, I actually found myself getting quite a bit apprehensive. I couldn't see into the basement at all until I was already halfway down the steps, so I was extremely nervous walking down them. The lights were off at the bottom, so I slowly took each step one at a time, feeling like punching myself for forgetting to turn the light on. Before I got to 4 steps from the bottom, I just jumped the rest of the way down and flipped on the light as quickly as possible. It was kinda weird, and I can't explain to this day why I felt that way, but for some reason I was really freaked out. I assume the movies were probably just sticking with me afterwards. I looked over at the clock on my nightstand and saw it was 3 a.m. now. I started wondering if maybe I should just turn out the light and run over to my bed to go to sleep. The faster I did, the quicker morning would come after all. I would feel silly for being scared. For some reason, I just couldn't bring myself to turn the light out though. Each time I tried, I would hesitate, and I decided that it was going to be light in 2.5 hours anyway. Maybe I should just leave the lights on and watch a comedy movie to calm myself down. Yeah, that was the better option. I turned on the lamp that was sitting on my nightstand and turned off the overhead lights. At this point, only the area around my bed was illuminated. I didn't have many comedies. I popped in an extremely bad film I had seen many times, the Pirate movie. As I watched, my eyes kept on shifting toward the windows. I had those basement windows, where a hole was dug into the ground so the basement could get some light. I also glanced over to the closet. I had never been this nervous before after some simple movies. I couldn't figure out exactly why I was so scared. About halfway through, close to 4 a.m., something suddenly caught my eye. I turned over to that window. I'm not sure exactly why I hadn't noticed it before, but now I saw the window was actually slightly open. I wondered if that was why I'd felt so paranoid. Perhaps I knew it was open on a subconscious level. I got up out of my bed and went over to close it. About halfway from the bed to the window though, suddenly I heard a shuffling sound coming from my closet. There was no doubt, someone was in there. I forgot about that window and took off out of the basement, screaming for my parents to get up and call the police. My dad grabbed his gun and went down to the basement. They caught the guy mid-act, trying to pull himself up and out the window. What we heard from the man was what he told the police. He broke into the basement around the time I was out getting myself that snack. He didn't think anyone was in there, and I'd caught him by surprise when I came back down. I hadn't seen him because it was so dark, so he hid in the closet real quick. I'd been going down the stairs so slowly that he had ample time to do this. For that 1 hour I was watching that movie in the dark, the man was in the closet, watching me through the slits in the door and waiting for me to fall asleep. Fortunately for me, he wasn't gonna come out of that closet until I went to bed. Who knows what he would have done to me if I had. Still though, there's something really unsettling about knowing someone is watching you from inside your own home and knowing that he was waiting for me to go to sleep the whole time. I used to go to this grindhouse theater in Los Angeles when I was a young teenager. I still get nostalgic for it, even though it really wasn't that nice of a place. It was actually in quite a bad part of town. It wasn't kept up very well either, and attracted a pretty low class of clientele. I figure I can say that without seeming prejudiced because I myself was a member of that low class clientele. From about age 13 onward, I would go and spend a day there. I missed that about those theaters. For less than $5, I could go there around noon, sit in a theater, and watch a bunch of really bad movies all day long. In fact, that became my normal weekend routine for several years on. When I was 15 though, I stopped going to that grindhouse. I had a pretty bad experience there. On this particular day, I can't really tell you what movie I was watching. They all kinda ran together at some point. I remember the experience much more than the movie anyway. Anyway, I was watching the movie and I was actually one of the only few people there. In the middle of the movie though, a group of 5 guys walked into the theater. Normally, I wouldn't have paid them any attention, except they all came right to where I was sitting and sat all around me. That really irritated me because the theater was practically empty. My irritation was only going to get worse. These guys began talking really loud throughout the movie and were pretty vulgar and not shy about it either. They kept talking back to the screen and laughing at the most inappropriate moments. I was beginning to get really aggravated, although I knew there wasn't much, if anything, I could do about it. Remember, this was kind of a run-down grindhouse theater, so they didn't have an usher. There was a guy working tickets and another guy working the snack counter, but that was about all the personnel there. I tried to drown out the men and watch the movie, only it started to get worse. The guy behind me started to kick the back of my chair, not just lightly tapping it, full-on kicking it with all his might. These guys were obviously trying to get me to yell at them or get irritated, and I was definitely getting irritated. Once again, I tried my best to ignore it, but they started harassing me so much I just couldn't anymore. I decided to get up and leave. These were 5 guys much older than me, at least in their late 20s, and I was one 15-year-old. It would have been stupid for me to start a fight all on my own. As I was leaving, they started making chicken sounds at me, of course, and calling me names. I did my best to shrug it off. It wasn't easy, but I did leave with my head held high. I was really upset. Once I left, I would have to pay again to go back into the theater and watch more movies. That was assuming they wouldn't be there all day, too. I decided it was still early enough for me to stick around a bit. I had the idea to kinda wait it out in the bathroom stall for a while until they left. Yeah, I know how that sounds, but I really didn't want to leave and have to spend more money. It was only about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I wanted to do more that day. Surely the guys had had their fun. When they realized I'd left, they would eventually leave too, and I could go back in safe and sound. After I had been sitting there for quite a while though, I heard the door open. I cringed, thinking that it might have been the guys who were sitting around me. I realized how stupid I was, and I probably should have just left the damn theater. I felt a bit calmer when I realized it was just one person, not 5. That calmness did not last very long though. Whoever this was walking very slowly, taking deliberate steps right up to me. I pulled my feet up further to hide myself in the stall. The slow steps continued, and by this point I could see the feet of the person on the other side of the door. He walked right over and stopped right in front of it. He didn't try to open the door, but he did begin to tap on it. I emphasize it was a tapping and not a knocking, because he was using some sort of object to do it. My anxiety was peaking, and I cursed myself again for not just leaving. He took the object and slid it in between the space and the door. I almost had a heart attack. It was a switchblade. I felt tears begin to form in my eyes. I was convinced this person was going to kill me. I couldn't do anything except remain on the toilet seat, practically crying to myself. The man took the knife and slid it up and down in the space before pulling it out. I could hear him doing something, but I wasn't sure what it was. It sounded like he was fumbling around. He then threw something over the stall onto me and ran out of the bathroom. I grabbed the object in surprise, then dropped it to the ground in terror when I realized it was a decapitated crow's head. Scared for my life, I got up and opened the stall. As I did, I noticed he had written something on the stall door in what I figured was the blood of that crow. It was my first name. Somehow, that guy knew my name. I was out of that place, and I didn't care that there was no usher in the building. I went right to the ticket counter and told them what happened. They called the cops. Actually, they were very nice and let me into the ticket booth as I waited for the cops to show up. All 5 guys were long gone by that point, though the cop was nice enough to give me a ride home. I have no idea how that guy knew my name. All I know is that I never saw any of those guys again, and I never went back to that grindhouse either. I've seen a few arcades around nowadays, but not nearly as many as they had back when I was growing up. The ones they have now are very different as well. Of course, the games are much more advanced, but that's not all that I mean. Maybe I'm just getting old. I don't know, but there's something about those old 80s style arcades that just fills me with a wonderful sense of nostalgia. I remember when standing around watching others play Pac-Man was a big deal. I never thought we would reach a time period where any video game was bigger than Pac-Man was. Now though, he's pretty much just an afterthought. I guess one of the better things about the arcades of today is that they tend to be in better parts of town and nicer buildings as well. The few I see are, at least in places like GamesWorks, all in areas that seem to be very low crime and are kept very clean and well maintained. In the late 70s and early 80s, a lot of people may not remember this, but arcades were really looked down upon by most people. Before Pac-Man was released, kids didn't even really hang out at arcades. They attracted an older group. Smoking, lots of drinking, very prominent dark stuff in arcades. Most people credit Pac-Man with being the game that brought children in, but even after Pac-Man, they didn't automatically become the nicest and safest places to be. I mention Pac-Man a lot because it has some relevance to my story. The game Pac-Land came out around 1984, and I was obsessed with wanting to play it. It basically just involved Pac-Man walking to the end of town, grabbing these magic boots, then running back to the beginning of the board, one of the earliest side-scrolling games. The only problem was that in the arcade I went to, I never really got a chance to play. I was 11 years old at the time, and that game always had a line of people waiting for it. An 11-year-old would never be able to get to the front of the line. My big break came though when Gauntlet was released in 1985. That game became the big video game of that arcade, freeing up most of the other machines in the place. I was 12 at this time, and I often headed down to the arcade on weekends by myself. My parents didn't really care. They didn't take any interest in what I did. The arcade I'd go to was in a crappy part of town right next to a 7-Eleven that had a pretty bad reputation as a gang hangout. The building itself was very dirty and was always loud due to the combination of noise from the games and the fact they were always playing extremely loud rock music. On this particular day, I got into the arcade when I noticed a large amount of people hanging out by the Gauntlet machine. There were other people scattered throughout, but not many. Gauntlet was a bit revolutionary for the time, since 4 people could play simultaneously. I became very excited. My expectations were that I would finally be able to play Pac-Land. Finally, I went to the part of the arcade where the game was, and was astounded to find it being played by only one person, an older teenager. Not to my surprise, really. The arcade had a rule that if you wanted to play a game after someone, you go up to the game and place a quarter upon it. That would save the game for you for the next turn. Excitedly, I ran up, took out my quarter, and put it down on the game. The guy playing it, momentarily distracted, turned and gave me a dirty look. I didn't really care because I was finally going to get to play this game. When he died though, the guy didn't let me take my turn. In fact, he took my quarter, slid it into the game, and began playing. I tried to protest in anger, but the guy just ignored me. I was so pissed off, but I couldn't do anything on my own. I went to speak with the guy at the counter, who exchanged dollars for quarters. I told him what happened. He came over to the Pac-Man game and confronted the guy. Like he had done with me, the teenager basically ignored the worker at first. The worker got annoyed with the guy for ignoring him, more than what he'd done to me. He told the guy he had to return my quarter to me. The teenager just ignored him again. The worker then put his hand on the guy's shoulder. The guy playing the game did not like that at all. He turned around and punched the worker right in the face. It only took a couple of moments before another guy who worked there, some sort of security or bouncer type, came over and threw the guy from the arcade. I smiled at him smugly as he was dragged out. As he was leaving, he threatened to find me and attack me. I finally got to play Pac-Land though, so I didn't care. I not only got to play it, but I played it a lot, so much that I completely lost track of time. It was already dark before I realized it. I still had to get home, so I left the arcade. Walking home, I started to hear footsteps not far behind me. It wasn't too weird of a thing, really. It was a pretty big neighborhood. As I made several turns onto different blocks, though, they kept following me. Feeling a bit apprehensive, I tried to glance behind me to see who it was. I'm sure you're not surprised to be told it was that teenager I'd pissed off earlier. He looked to be carrying what looked like the leg of a coffee table. Scared, I began to run, and I heard him chasing behind me. I cursed myself over and over for looking back, and stupidly did so again. My foot got caught on an uneven crack between the sidewalk blocks, and I fell face first onto the ground. I didn't realize in the moment, but the impact broke my nose. I did know right away that my face was covered in blood. When I turned up, I noticed the man coming closer to me. I saw it actually was a coffee table leg with one long screw pointing out of the end. As he came closer, he said something I'll never forget. "You want to go to Pac-Land? I'll send you to Pac-Land." He wasn't upon me yet, so I went for broke. I jumped up and ran to the nearest house, pounding on the door, yelling and screaming bloody murder. I didn't even know whose house it was, but I didn't care. And the people who lived there answered the door immediately, and fortunately for me, ran the teenager off. The people in that house were also kind enough to call my parents, who took me to the emergency room and forbade me from ever going to the arcade again. I was very upset, of course, but they did buy me a ColecoVision, and the very first game they got me was Pac-Land, so I was satisfied. A few years ago, I was working at a pizza chain in my hometown as a driver. I was 27, but made damn good money delivering. I'd worked at a few other places, both local and chain, in the years before, and still work as a dasher on occasion, even after this happened. Now I choose to deliver in much safer areas though, for this exact reason. I got luckier than I could ever imagine. One night I was working and I had a double, 2 deliveries to take. Both were cash orders. I had $12 left in my bank, which drivers are given to use as change for cash orders, so you don't have to have a ton of cash on you at all times. The first order went smoothly. The guy gave me $50 for a $35 order, so I was excited about the nice tip. I drove to the second delivery. It was an apartment complex with multiple buildings. I had delivered there before, in fact. The sun was about to set, but it was still very light out. The chain I worked at had us drive company cars with a logo on them, all white sedans. I grabbed the order and went to the door of the apartment building. A young guy came out. A much bigger, older guy was outside smoking a cigarette. The big guy went inside as the smaller guy came out. He looked around nervously and asked how much he owed me. The way he was looking around just made me very nervous too. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I told him the amount, and he said that wasn't what he was told on the phone. Immediately, something felt wrong. I felt someone else walk out behind me from the door, as the first young guy looked around down the parking lot, craning his neck as if he was looking for someone. I told him the amount again, and broke down the order for him, trying to keep calm. Then the first guy held a gun right to my temple. I felt a poke on my spine. 2 gunmen. I couldn't speak. Words wouldn't form no matter how hard I tried. "Give me your money and keys now," the first guy growled. I fumbled immediately for the keys. I gave him my bank but hadn't realized the 50 was mixed in. I gave him the keys, trying my best to remain calm. Another guy came from my left. He had poofy hair and was around the same age as the first kid. The one behind me I hadn't seen yet. The big-haired kid grabbed the pizza bag and ran off and hid. The first one searched the company car. Luckily, I had left my wallet in my personal car. I saw him grab my cell phone. That's when the panic began to set in. I had pictures on that phone that I hadn't backed up of my then 5-year-old son, who's absolutely my world. Please don't take that. I have pictures of my son who died on there. It's all I have of him, please." I lied. My son was very much alive. The kid behind me spoke softly. "Trust me, just listen to him. You'll get it back undamaged. I don't want to be here either." I could tell he'd been crying by how his voice sounded. A car began pulling in, and the 3 boys took off to the other end of the complex in a full sprint. Before the one behind me ran, he dropped the gun right in front of me. Standard issue 9mm silver and black, safety off. Looked real enough to me. He picked it back up and ran off with the others. The car that pulled in saw me. A woman and her kid, it seemed. Panic set in as I realized they could easily come back and do way worse to me, and the sky was starting to get dark. I had collapsed. They had taken the company car keys, $72, the pizza, and my phone. The woman ran up to me and asked if I was alright. She took me into her apartment in the next building over and locked the door. I was shaking so hard I couldn't even hold her phone to talk to 911 as she sat down her kid. Her boyfriend, I assumed, helped me call. I spoke to the operator and told them everything. I'm colorblind. Thankfully, these guys were all wearing black and white clothes. I had a full description of 2 of them. The poor woman who helped me was going to be late for work, but she stayed until I was off the phone and the cops had shown up. Man, she was harsh and blunt with the operator. I'll never forget this woman's utter kindness to me though, and her boyfriend's as well. The cops showed up and contacted my store. My manager brought out the spare keys for me to drive the car back. After dealing with the cops, I drove back and was greeted by crying and beyond worried coworkers. All of them were terrified I'd been killed or something. It meant a lot to me to see how much they cared. I told them I was fine. I filed the proper paperwork, and the $72 was written off as a loss to the store. Thank God, because I had worked other stores that make you pay back the money out of pocket if you get robbed to prevent drivers from stealing. The owner told me to take the rest of the night off and take care of myself. He gave me a hug as well. Guy was one of the best bosses I ever had. What I didn't know yet was that I was in for a much longer night still. I called my best friend before I left the store from the store phone and asked where he was. We usually met up for drinks after work, and he was around the corner at a bar. I met up with him. His dad was a District 4 cop in my city at the time, the same district this happened in. He told me his dad had given him a heads up, and he had 2 shots waiting for me to calm my nerves. We had begun playing pool when his dad called his cell phone and asked if I was with him yet. He said yeah and handed me the phone. His dad asked if I could come down to the station. I was honest and told him I'd had some to drink, so he sent out a squad car to get me. We got down to the station and they had the suspects in custody. All I needed was to ID them. 3 boys and a driver. They'd been caught less than 20 minutes after the robbery speeding. The bolo had already gone out and they matched the description perfectly. They used the money to buy weed and gas and took off. They had at least 15 stolen cell phones on them. The order had been placed on a stolen phone. My phone was in the mix in a box. The police told me to grab my phone only, and I did so. They asked me to unlock it. It had fingerprint verification, so that was easy enough. I noticed that 9 of the 10 tries to unlock it had already been used before my phone would completely reset. It unlocked right away. I told the police every detail yet again, although my parental instincts kicked in. I told them the guy behind me quite obviously had been bullied into this, and to show that guy some mercy, the only guy in a white shirt. The police told me he was the only one that was talking. The other 3 denied involvement. And that's when I found out about the 4th guy, the driver. We found out later he was completely unaware of anything and just happened to be picking up his friends. He was never charged. The boy who was behind me and the one who grabbed the pizza were 15 and 16 and got 6 months of house arrest. The only reason the one behind me got off easy, despite having the gun to my back, was because I asked them to go easy on him. He was the only one that was confessing as well. Makes sense since he even said the other guy wouldn't have the phone for long. He was planning on going to the cops had they not been caught in the first place. The other guy, the first kid who put the gun to my temple, it was his 18th birthday, so he got the full book thrown at him. In the courtroom, he tried to make fun of me and was laughing at me. Seeing him made me panic. The judge scolded him for his behavior, and he just grinned and glared at me like the Joker. All I could see was pure evil. I know that kid will commit more crimes. No doubt eventually he'll end someone's life. You could see how cold he was just by looking into his eyes. I never want to see that again. I asked to have my name stricken from the records, and asked to remain anonymous in case he ever got out. I'm glad I did, because today I got a letter from the state, and he's being released in February. The court only had my old address, and my mom didn't think the letter was important. I missed the deadline to protest his release for probation. The plea deal was for 8 years, but it's only been 4, getting out early due to overcrowding. Not good behavior, just overcrowding. This coming February,